Skip it up and that up. What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? This is Rich of Review Tech USA, and recently IGN released an article going over the specifications of the PlayStation 4. Now, these rumored specs for the PlayStation 4 are very interesting for a couple reasons. One, they are a lot more anemic than the other rumored specs that says the PlayStation 4 would utilize an AMD Radeon HD 7950. This new article from IGN says it would utilize an AMD Radeon HD 7670 GPU, which is identical to the 6670 GPU that's rumored to be in the Xbox 720. They are also saying the main processor in the PlayStation 4 will be the AMD A8 3850 APU. Now, although Sony utilizing an AMD APU for their next-gen console was still a rumor, there has to be some truth to it because this rumor has been spreading around the web for a while. I remember seeing an article a year ago talking about how Sony is going to use an AMD APU for their next-gen console. But anyway, let's get on to the main event of this video. Let's compare the rumored specs of the Wii U to the PlayStation 4 and see who comes out on top. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is the main processors, the CPUs inside the Wii U and the PlayStation 4. I'll talk about the general specs of both processors and discuss why this is a tough comparison. As you take a look at these specs on screen and as I discuss them, keep in mind that it has been confirmed by Nintendo and IBM that the Wii U will sport a Power 7 processor. The only thing we don't know yet about the Power 7 processor in the Wii U is its exact specs. So I looked up the entry-level Power 7 CPU that IBM offers and took those specs to compare to the PlayStation 4's processor. Keep in mind, all these specifications are subject to change. So let's take a look at the possible specs of the Power 7 processor in the Wii U. Its clock rate can be anywhere from 2.4 to 4.25 gigahertz. It's going to have 64 kilobytes of L1 cache per core, 32 kilobytes for data and 32 kilobytes for instructions. It's going to have 256 kilobytes of L2 cache per core, and although this may be trimmed down even more, the entry-level Power 7 CPU had 4 megabytes of L3 cache per core, giving the base model Power 7 CPU 16 megabytes of L3 cache. The other trick the Power 7 processor will have up its sleeve inside the Wii U is that it's capable of simultaneous multi-threading, meaning that each core inside the Power 7 CPU can handle multiple threads of code at once. Now, I will backtrack somewhat from my previous video. I heard some rumors around the web that the Power 7 CPU for the Wii U will only be capable of handling 2 threads of code per core, not 4. But with that being said, that's still a one-up it has over the AMD APU that could be inside the PlayStation 4. The PlayStation 4's rumored quad-core processor is not capable of simultaneous multi-threading at all, meaning that it can only handle 1 thread of code per core at a time. Now let's take a look at the AMD A8 3850 processor that's rumored to be inside the PlayStation 4. It has a clock rate of 2.9 gigahertz. It has 128 kilobytes of L1 cache per core, 64 kilobytes for data and 64 kilobytes for instruction. It has 1 megabyte of L2 cache per core, and it does not have any L3 cache. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking, Rich, it's obvious which processor is the clear winner here. It's going to be the Power 7 CPU inside the Wii U. But it's not 100% clear who is the better performer here for a couple reasons. One is that the architecture of the Power 7 CPU and the architecture of the AMD APU are totally different. The Power 7 CPU that is developed by IBM runs on the RISC architecture, which stands for Reduced Instruction Set Computing. This means that it would take less lines of code for a processor based on the RISC architecture to execute a task than it would for a processor based on another form of architecture, i.e. the x86 architecture that the AMD APU that may be in the PlayStation 4 is based on. But it isn't that easy, like I stated before. Once again, it depends on how fast the Power 7 processor is clocked inside the Wii U, and although developers are very familiar with the RISC architecture, it's been around forever, they are also very familiar with the x86 architecture. So even though RISC processors are supposed to be more efficient on paper, developers still may be able to squeeze out an equal amount of performance out of the x86 APU inside the PS4 simply because they're so familiar with the architecture. It's been around forever. More than likely, the computer you're sitting on now watching this video has a processor that runs the x86 architecture. On top of that, the APU, the accelerated processing unit that's rumored to be inside the upcoming PlayStation 4, also has a trick up its sleeve as well. Incorporated onto the same die as the AMD quad-core processor is a 6560D GPU. This is a graphics processor that runs at 600 MHz and has 400 shader units. Now by itself, this is a very entry-level gaming GPU. You're only going to play current PC games at medium to low settings. However, if you combine this graphics processor with the AMD HD 7670 that's also rumored to be inside the PlayStation 4, this dual graphics setup can actually alleviate some of the workload off of the 7670, giving the PlayStation 4 a boost in graphics and performance. So like I said, we could look at the specifications of these processors as much as we want, but due to the fact they run on two totally different architectures and have totally different features, it's very tough to declare who the true winner is. Now let's take a look at the various graphics processors that are rumored to be inside the Wii U and PlayStation 4 and compare them head to head. Now again, it has been confirmed that the GPU inside of the Wii U will be based on the AMD R700 architecture, but just like the CPU, exact specs have not been confirmed. So although a consistent rumor has been around the web that the Wii U will sport an AMD Radeon HD 4850, to be totally fair, I'm going to do multiple comparisons of multiple rumored GPUs for both the PS4 and Wii U, both on the high end and low end of the spectrum. So let's begin. So what you're taking a look at here is the entry-level GPU specs for the PlayStation 4, hell you could even say the Xbox 720, and the Wii U. Keep in mind that the AMD Radeon HD 6670 and 7670 are identical when it comes to performance. Now before I get into the specifications of all these graphics processors, one big advantage the PlayStation 4's GPU will have over the Wii U's is that it is DirectX 11 capable. The GPU inside of the Wii U is only DirectX 11 10.1 capable. So right off the bat, there's going to be a whole list of features that the PlayStation 4 GPU can do that the Wii U's GPU cannot. Okay, anyway, enough disclaimers, let's start talking specs. The core and shader clocks inside the Radeon HD 6670 or 7670, whatever you want to call it, is 800 MHz for both. The core and shader clocks inside the Radeon HD 4770 are 750 MHz. Not a huge difference in performance right there when it comes to clock speed, but it is enough that it can be somewhat noticeable. The memory clock inside the 6670 is 2000 MHz, and the memory clock inside the ATI Radeon 4770 is 1600 MHz. And I have to say that is a somewhat substantial speed difference between the 6670 and the 4770. The faster the frame buffer is on the video card or video chipset, the smoother your frame rate on the screen will be. Keep that in mind. Why do you think that people overclock the memory of their video cards in their computers? On top of that, the Radeon HD 6770 also has a big one up when it comes to memory bandwidth. It has a rated performance of 64 gigabytes per second, while the 4770 only has a memory bandwidth of 51.2 gigabytes a second. However, this is where things start to sway in favor of the ATI Radeon 4770. When it comes to floating operations per second, the Radeon HD 6670 can only handle 768 gigaflops per second, where the Radeon HD 4770 can handle 960 gigaflops per second. The pixel fill rate on the HD 6770 is only 6400 megapixels per second, where on the HD 4770 it's 12,000 megapixels per second. That's almost double the performance. Now when it comes to texture fill rate, the 4770 has the 6670 beat as well. The 6670 texture fill rate is 19,200 megatexels a second, whereas the Radeon HD 4770 has a 24,000 megatexel per second fill rate. Again, a substantial difference. I also want to let it be known that even though the 7670/6670 are DirectX 11 capable GPUs, due to the fact that they're entry-level DirectX 11 graphics processors, they're not going to be able to take advantage of the DirectX 11 feature set like a mid-range or upper-end graphics processor would be able to. So even though the Wii U's graphics processor lacks DirectX 11 support, the DirectX 11 capabilities of the PlayStation 4's graphics processor may not be a huge advantage if they decide to go with an entry-level chip. Now let's go on to compare the next possible PS4 versus Wii U graphics configuration. Compared to the 4850, which is heavily rumored to be the graphics processor inside the Wii U, the 6670 does excel in certain areas. But even though the architecture of the 4850 is older than the architecture of the 6670, the Radeon HD 4850 also outperforms the 6670 in certain categories. The core and shader clocks of the 6670 run at 800 MHz, while the core and shader clocks of the 4850 run 175 MHz slower at 625 MHz. The memory clock of the 6670 6670 is over double the speed of the 4850, with the memory in the 6670 running at 2000 MHz and the memory clock of the 4850 being only 993 MHz. But clock speeds aren't everything, and this is where things get interesting and the 4850 starts to outperform the 6670. The memory bandwidth of both GPUs that you're looking at here is almost identical, with the 6670 having a memory bandwidth of 64 gigabytes a second and the 4850 coming in at a very close second with a memory bandwidth of 63.552 gigabytes a second. So even though the memory of the 6670 is clocked at over double the speed of the 4850, they both have the same memory bandwidth, so their performance is going to be identical. And this is where the 4850 actually outshines the 6670. When it comes to floating operations per second, the rumored PS4 GPU can only handle 768 gigaflops per second, while the rumored Wii U GPU can handle 1000 gigaflops per second. Although pixel fill rates haven't been as important since DirectX 9 video cards have been released, the rumored Wii U GPU still outperforms the PlayStation 4 supposed GPU with a pixel fill rate of 10,000 megapixels a second, while the potential PlayStation 4 GPU only has a pixel fill rate of 6400 megapixels a second. And last but not least, let's look at the texture fill rate of both cards. The 6670 has a texture fill rate of 19,200 megatexels a second, with the Radeon HD 4850 outclassing it with a texture fill rate of 25,000 megatexels a second. So things are looking real good for Nintendo at this moment, right? Well, let's see how Nintendo's graphics processor will hold up if the other rumors about the PS4 hold true, and it receives a 7950 AMD GPU, which is much more powerful than the 6670. And now, folks, this is where things can get really bad for Nintendo if the PlayStation 4 has an AMD Radeon HD 7950 inside of it. Where do I even begin with how much more powerful the 7950 is over the 4850? 175 megahertz faster with the core and shader clocks. And clock speeds aside, that's not even including the fact that the 7950 has much newer technology inside of it. And it gets even worse for Nintendo's GPU. The memory is over double the speed. The memory inside the 7950 is 2500 megahertz. The memory inside the ATI Radeon 4850 is only 993 megahertz. Now look at the memory bandwidth. Now compare the memory bandwidth between the two cards. 7950, 240 gigabytes a second. Nintendo's GPU, the 4850, only 63.552 gigabytes a second. The 7950 almost has 4 times the memory bandwidth of the 4850. Ouch. Even more bad news. 7950 floating operations per second, 2,867.2 gigaflops per second. The Radeon HD 4850, only 1,000 gigaflops per second. Again, almost 3 times the performance coming out of the Radeon HD 7950. Same thing with the pixel fill rate. 7950, 25,600 megapixels a second. 4850, only 10,000 megapixels a second. The texture fill rate of the 7950 is 89,600 megatexels a second, and the texture fill rate of the 4850 is only 25,000 megatexels a second. Look, I'll end this video with this. If this is the scenario that actually happens where the PS4 gets an amazing GPU like the 7950, and the Wii U at best gets a 4850, or maybe Nintendo decides to cut costs even more and goes with the 4770, Nintendo's going to be in bad shape. They're going to be in the same shape they are now with the original Wii. Now, I know every fanboy is going to come to me and say, hey Rich, Nintendo's not just about graphics, Nintendo's about great gameplay, they have great first-party exclusives, it almost has 100 million units shipped worldwide. I understand all that, I get that, but what you don't understand is that a console needs to keep selling for a company to make a profit off of it. It doesn't matter that they have the first place trophy, and the reason the original Wii is hurting right now is because it is way behind the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 when it comes to hardware, and third-party companies can't develop the same games for the Wii that they can for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. The system can't handle it. Now, if the PS4 and Xbox 720 get the 7670, that's going to be a different story. In some aspects, the Wii U's GPU, even if it's a 4770 inside the Wii U, actually outperforms a 7670. And even if Sony goes with the APU where it has a secondary GPU right on the main processor, it'll help, but it's not going to make a huge difference with the visuals. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed this very detailed overview of all the rumored specs that I've been hearing about the PS4 and Wii U. Make sure to leave your thoughts in the comments section below, rate this video, and subscribe. And as always, thank you for supporting Review Tech USA. And after this video, I'm gonna need a 6-pack, not just one beer.